The UK in the EU. Should it stay or should it go? Prime Minister David Cameron is trying to thrash out a new deal to save his country's relationship with the rest of Europe ahead of a vote where Britons will decide whether or not they belong in the Union. What would a so-called Brexit mean for the UK and for the European project? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. The British have never been completely sold on the idea of the European project. As countries elsewhere on the continent move towards greater political and economic integration, many Britons remain sceptical at best. At worst, they're mistrustful of the increasing say bureaucrats in Brussels have over how they run their affairs. In just a few months' time, the British people will be asked to decide, should they stay in the Union or leave it? And to persuade the doubters, British Prime Minister David Cameron has been trying to secure changes to the UK's relationship with the EU, and this is what he's holding out for. Restricting child benefits and in-work benefits for up to 4 years for EU migrants arriving in Britain. Opting out of one of the EU's driving principles that members work towards an ever closer union. Stopping EU financial regulation, which some say is strangling business in Britain. And introducing more protections for the 9 EU countries, including Britain, that aren't in the Eurozone. So how did we get here? Well, the dream of the modern European Union began after the end of the Second World War. The hope was to create a community of countries through economic and political union. In 1951, the Treaty of Paris established the European Coal and Steel Community, which would eventually become the European Economic Community. In 1992, the Maastricht Treaty was signed, creating the modern European Union. In 2007, the Lisbon Treaty was an attempt to streamline the EU institutions in Brussels. From the original 6, there are now a total of 28 countries in the EU. But there are now fears that if Britain does leave, it could put the whole European project in jeopardy. So plenty to look at this Inside Story. So let's bring in our guests to do so. Joining us from London is Matthew Goodwin, Visiting Senior Fellow in the Europe Programme at Chatham House. From Brussels, Daniel Hannan, a member of the European Parliament for the Conservative Party. And also from London, Nina Schick, a policy analyst at Open Europe. Welcome, all of you. Let's first of all look at Cameron's proposals for a new EU deal, because this potentially can dictate the way the UK will vote in a few months' time. And it is proving, isn't it, to be a tough sell to other European nations. Nina Schick, do you think Cameron will get what he wants in this package of EU reforms?
Well, Cameron has laid out 4 broad areas which he wants to reform, and it certainly looks like he will get something in each of those 4 areas. And EU leaders have basically said that this was, a difficult negotiation and so on. But I think Cameron's real challenge now is selling that deal at home, where there's a very domestically sceptical public, and that's his real challenge. I think that's what he'll be focusing on now.
Absolutely. We'll move on to that bigger discussion in just a few minutes. For the moment, I want to look a bit more at these reforms. Matthew, what extent do you think, if we break them down a bit, they can actually benefit the UK? I'm looking, for example, at something like opting out of an ever closer union. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, looking at the renegotiation overall and the nuts and bolts of the 4 baskets, there's actually very little here that is pointing towards substantial change that would, really have a significant impact on how Britain goes about its business. One of the key areas, just picking up on what Nina said, there really relates actually not to the ever closer union principle, which most voters aren't really aware of, but rather the proposed changes around benefits for EU migrant workers. And one of Cameron's real problems there is he's really selling this change as something that would remove what he calls a so-called pull factor for EU migrant workers into Britain. There's actually very little evidence to support that proposition. So I think after this renegotiation when he tries to talk through the detail of what he's trying to deliver. I think quite a significant number of voters will actually realise that that falls well short of what Cameron had initially put forward after his Bloomberg speech in 2013, where he talked, for example, about overhauling the entire principle of free movement or having fundamental treaty change. So I think there is an opening actually here for the Eurosceptics, and it'll be interesting to see how that develops.
And, these reforms may fall short of what Britons expect of Cameron, but they're still upsetting, aren't they, other European nations? Why?
Well, obviously for the other EU nations, this is something which they've seen as Britain cherry-picking, Britain wanting special exceptions in the EU, and certain countries have not been happy at all with the, tampering with what they think is the principle of free movement. But actually, if you're a reformer, everybody on this panel, I think, will agree that the EU is in decline. A few decades ago, the EU accounted for 30% of global GDP. Now it's 15%. So undoubtedly, the EU needs to change. And one can see Cameron's renegotiation as starting that conversation. I don't think it's a transformative deal. The deal, of course, hasn't been finalized, but what we know in the draft, it's not transformative, but it's a step in the right direction.
Daniel, let's bring you in. I know from looking at an interview my producer did with you that you love Europe, that you are a member of the European Parliament, but you do want the UK to leave. Do you agree with Nina that the EU is in decline?
Well, it's not a question of agreeing with Nina, it's a question of agreeing with the data. As Nina correctly says, as recently as 1980, the EU was 30% of the world's GDP. Today, it's just over 15%, but the direction is very clear, and it's not going to get any better. There are long-term demographic shifts that are making Europe a smaller share of the world economy, and the EU is exacerbating those problems by its determination to keep the euro going at whatever cost to the people who use the euro, even if that means inflicting ruinous unemployment and poverty and emigration across the Mediterranean. They can't bring themselves to let go of that project. And so I think the question we face in Britain is, do we have to make those problems our problems? Having stayed out of the euro, having stayed out of the Schengen zone on free movement, are we going to be dragged into those things? Or don't we, as a maritime country, as a global country with older alliances around the world, don't we have other options in the bits of the world that are still growing? And when I say the bits of the world that are still growing, I mean the whole of the rest of the world. The only continents on the planet not experiencing economic growth at present are Antarctica and Europe. So this is no place for a trading country like ours to find itself.
OK. Nina, I know that you've said that the UK financial services are, however, at great risk if Britain pulls out of the EU. So there aren't only advantages to leaving.
Well, we don't think that it's a situation where if the UK were to leave the EU, the UK can survive. There's every reason why the UK could survive. Having said that, there would be challenges in what kind of deal the UK can strike with the rest of the EU. And also, interestingly, those who want to leave, some, like Dan, will see the necessity for the UK to open up to the rest of the world, be more liberal, have a fairly liberal policy on things like immigration. But let's not forget that a lot of the camp who wants to leave also wants to become more protectionist and shut down the border. So the question for the UK really is, once it leaves the EU, can it strike a balance, first of all, with a good deal with the EU, and also have the domestic policies put in place here? That means they are fairly liberal on things like immigration, which we think is necessary for the UK to flourish economically outside of the EU. And those are questions that still need to be answered, really.
Matthew, when it comes to campaigning, what are both sides going to be putting to the average Briton on the street? I mean, if you look at our membership of the EU, how is each side going to sell economically us staying in the Union?
Well, there are different sets of arguments for both sides. What's interesting about the referendum, when you look at the voters, is that the current supporters of the Remain camp and the Leave camp, they actually look very different. The referendum is underpinned by some very strong social divides within Britain. The Leave vote is typically strongest among the over 55s, people who identify as English rather than British, people who often left school earlier, didn't go to university, and people who feel profoundly anxious not just over Britain's integration into the EU, but also immigration, and feel distrustful towards established politicians. But those on the Remain side, however, they tend to be from the more financially secure, more stable, economically stable middle classes, more common in places like Scotland and Wales and London, some of the more urban areas. So there are very clear sort of differences between those two. What's really interesting, however, is when you look at those undecided voters, because they represent somewhere between 15 and 20% of the electorate. And if we're to believe the current opinion polls, which suggest that the race is very close, and they could make all the difference. And those undecided voters often tend to lean towards the Conservatives. They tend to be a bit younger. They're more averse to risk than the kind of core Remain and Leave voters. And I think they're probably more likely to be swayed by arguments around their economic well-being, more so than perhaps arguments over sovereignty and immigration. So both the camps are going to have to proceed very carefully. It is worth just briefly mentioning, just finally, some research that we've just done on the power of different arguments at this referendum. And what we find consistently is that whether Remain or Leave frame the arguments, whether it comes to Remain or Leave, if you frame the argument in a positive light, that has a far more significant effect on their support than talking about all the negatives. So, for example, don't talk about economic costs, don't talk about the problems of immigration, but try and frame the narrative in a more positive, forward-looking way. And we find consistently that really does have an effect on both the Remain and Leave camps. The question is, do they have the discipline to do that?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Dan, isn't it, that in these sort of votes, in these referendums, people do tend to stick to the status quo, better the devil you know. So what positive arguments for leaving the EU might the Leave camp make to try and sway voters?
Sure. I mean, Matthew is 100% right. We need to win in an upbeat, optimistic, cheerful way with arguments that are making the democratic and economic case for independence. There is a minority of people who are focused on immigration, but those are not the swing voters, as Matthew correctly says. And I think there is a microeconomic case. Outside the EU, our food bills will be lower, our fuel bills will be cheaper, our taxes will be lower. I think people will be better off in terms of their household budgets. Those three things I mentioned, food, fuel and taxes, are typically the three largest items for most of us. But I think there's also a macroeconomic argument about the opportunities that come to Britain as a global trading nation. In the 70s, when we joined, it still looked as though regional trade blocs were the future. The EU, in a sense, is a sort of hangover from an era when freight costs were high and refrigeration was expensive, and people thought in terms of continental blocs. Now, the internet has abolished that world. Geographical proximity has never mattered less than it does today. And for a country like Britain, which is linked by language and law, by habit and history to every continent and every archipelago, it just makes no sense to be tied to the world's only stagnant customs union. There is a great future for us. We're the 5th largest economy on the planet. We're on course to overtake Germany by 2030. We have the 4th largest military budget. We're one of 5 permanent seat holders on the UN Security Council. Our language is the most widely spoken by the human species. We have the world's capital city. You know, how much bigger do we have to be before we're able to live under our own laws, trading with our friends and allies in Europe, interested and involved in the affairs of all continents, including Europe, but ultimately governing ourselves?
OK. Nina, how do you respond to those pretty strong words from Daniel? It just makes no sense to be tied to the EU any longer, that regional trade blocs are a thing of the past.
Well, I absolutely agree with Dan in the sense that, again, we don't think that Brexit would be cataclysmic for the UK, and there's no reason why the UK should not flourish outside of the EU. Having said that, it's still noteworthy to point out that there is no guarantee that the domestic decisions taken here will be liberal, free trading and open. That's just a challenge that we have to think about. Even though the swing voters might be won over by an optimistic case, which I think is definitely true, there's a lot of people who will vote to leave on the case of immigration and a more protectionist vision of the UK. And that's something, obviously, that might be reflected once the UK has voted to leave.
Matthew, also, it was the point was raised to me before coming on the show that the US would be rather upset if the UK left. It's very much in favour of its staying within the EU. So might relations there be a little rocky if the UK decides to go it alone?
Well, I can understand the incentives for the Americans in putting across that view, and I'm sure that we'll have a high-profile intervention at some point from President Obama trying to convince Britons to vote to remain in the EU. But I don't think that will necessarily be a game changer in the referendum debate. And just to pick up on the previous comment there, you know, there is a real disconnect between how business and many in politics view this referendum and how ordinary voters view this particular issue. And that disconnect really centres on the role of economics. Economics are important, right? But for the average voter, this isn't just about jobs, housing and GDP. It's so, you know, when the head of HSBC says, well, you know, potentially we might, you know, move some jobs abroad, or the head of, you know, car company X says, well, we're going to go to Germany if you vote for Brexit. That isn't all that voters care about. Embedded in this issue of Britain's place in Europe are some very intense concerns over national identity, national community, and sets of values that people feel are being threatened by European integration. The key challenge for the Eurosceptics is to de-risk Brexit, but to also speak to that broader identity concern in a non-toxic way, you know, in a non-stigmatizing way. The key challenge for the Remain camp is to actually get out of their comfort zone, not just talk about bland statistics over jobs and wages and, you know, financial aspects, but to actually somehow try and talk as well to that feeling that British identity is under threat.
It's a very important point that I did also want to bring into the discussion, because of course economics and bureaucracy don't often determine a vote, emotions do. And Daniel, perhaps you can help us put a voice to how Britons actually feel about the EU.
I mean, I don't think it's the sense that our identity is going to be dissolved or something. I mean, in a way, if that were to happen, if we were all to start thinking of ourselves as Europeans in the same sense that somebody might think of himself as Swedish or Portuguese or Hungarian, then there'd be no problem. You know, then it would actually be feasible to create a continental democratic system. The trouble is that people don't do that, you know, whether in Britain or in other countries. Our main identity, our main affinities are with national institutions that have earned our loyalty over many decades, or in our country's case, over many centuries. And, you know, it doesn't need to be, to use Matthew's word, a toxic thing. Patriotism to me is not a dirty word. Patriotism is why I pay taxes to support people I've never met. It's why I obey laws even when I think they're stupid laws. It's why I accept election results even when I voted for the losing party or stood for the losing party, which has happened to me from time to time. You know, patriotism is what gives us that community of identity, that sense of shared purpose that makes a functioning democracy possible. Now, we have that within the UK, you know, or within France or within Portugal or whatever. I don't think it exists within the European Union. And that's really always been the argument. If the European Union were just a regional club, if it were just about coming together and doing things in common and trading and talking and so on, nobody would be against it. We wouldn't now be holding this referendum. You'd have to be insane to be against the idea of collaboration with your immediate neighbours. The problem is that it doesn't stop there. It has aspirations to be a political union, to be some kind of federation, and that, I think, is something that British people are not going to accept. And this referendum is our one chance, amicably, to step off that conveyor belt.
And Nina, let's move the discussion a little bit, because we've been looking a lot at how a Brexit might affect the UK. Let's shift the discussion to how it might affect the EU. I mean, would a UK exit jeopardise the EU project?
Absolutely. I think economically it's going to jeopardize the EU. Let's not forget that the UK is one of the largest contributors to the budget. If the UK were to leave, that would mean that the voting weights would shift so that a more protectionist bloc is in charge. And also, symbolically, it's massive. I mean, this is a club where people have always wanted to join. And for the first time, you have such an important member leaving at a time when the EU's been faced with successive crisis after crisis, the Eurozone crisis, the migration crisis, and then a Brexit. I mean, symbolically, it's very, very important. And I think that the rest of the EU will definitely hurt if there is a Brexit.
Matthew, how far then do you think the EU will go to keep the UK in the Union? I mean, I'm looking at recent events in Greece and the huge costs that it was willing to bear to stop the Grexit.
Well, I think the EU will be relatively happy with what's about to happen over the next 48 hours. I think they were probably quite content with David Cameron's demands. I don't think he was asking for anything that was, you know, that would push them beyond their sort of realm of comfort. I think this is all fairly standard stuff that would have to have been negotiated and discussed at some point. Anyway, I think the big risk for the EU, obviously, is if we do indeed have Brexit, then this does spark some kind of contagion effect, and you have, you know, very strong Eurosceptic parties now, both in sort of west and east and north and south. Populism, you know, is perhaps as strong as it has ever been. But, you know, that should not, I don't think, play a role in the British debate, which should fundamentally centre on the question of, you know, is this good or bad for Britain? But I do think perhaps some of the European member states have perhaps not quite understood the dynamics of British public opinion around this, and in particular haven't understood the importance of those identity issues to the British electorate. I don't think David Cameron is going to be on strong ground when he comes back with the benefit change and the break. I think that would be quite easy for Eurosceptics to tear apart, and that ultimately, in my view, is where much of this debate is going to take place.
Daniel, how engaged do you think the British public is in this debate and in this vote? Are we going to see a huge turnout in Britain?
I don't know. The wonderful thing about referendums is that we politicians don't know. They are a great mechanism to remind us that we work for everybody else. And I'm generally a fan of referendums, not just on this issue. I think it's always a good thing to bring politics back to the people that politicians purport to speak for. I think that what Nina and Matthew just said, though, about the impact on the other countries is very interesting. And it's something that one hears also from the Foreign Secretary and indeed from the Prime Minister, that if Britain were to walk away, the other countries would move in a more protectionist, more federalist direction. Well, if that's true, let's for a moment just extend the logic and think about the implications, because what that's therefore saying is the natural tendency of the rest of the EU, apart from Britain, is towards protectionism and political integration. So if we are, if you like, slightly slowing the advance of the other countries towards that destination, surely the corollary is that we're being pulled slightly in that direction. And if we left, we would spring apart. We would move in a more liberal direction and a more globalist direction. So although Matthew has been speaking about, well, there are fears of some of the people in the No campaign being, you know, against it for different reasons from mine, the reality is a post-EU Britain with the current government, with its current assumptions and the current government machine, I'm sure would move right away towards a kind of open economy, zero tariff, international and trading relationship. And it would have an approach to immigration that was not a closed door, but that was based on taking the best talent from wherever in the world. Instead of allowing people privileged access if they hold EU passports, we should take people on the basis of their skills, and we should stop this institutional discrimination against Commonwealth citizens who have often long-standing family links to this country, but who are effectively elbowed aside because they don't hold EU passports.
OK, Nina, last word to you. Would you agree with that very optimistic view that if the UK left, it would do so with no obstacles whatsoever?
I mean, this debate is obviously divided between two sides. One saying, you know, if we leave, we'll become like Hong Kong overnight and we'll be free trading, it won't be a problem. And the other side saying, if we were to leave, it'll be a catastrophe, we couldn't stomach a Brexit. But the reality is, it's far more nuanced and it's far more balanced. When we played out a Brexit scenario just a few weeks ago, we found that the rest of the EU might be quite difficult for the UK to strike a favourable deal, especially on services. So there are challenges, and I don't think you can simply assume that the British public would be in favour of a liberal immigration policy, for example. I mean, immigration has been an issue that's been very contentious here in the UK, and I don't think that we can assume that the British public will be in favour of that. So I think the main point, what I'm trying to say, is that there are challenges. If the UK leaves, there are challenges, and that's something that domestically the country will have to overcome.
Absolutely fascinating to talk to you all today, and it's going to be an issue obviously that we're going to be revisiting at length over the coming months. Thanks very much for joining us, Matthew Goodwin, Daniel Hannan and Nina Schick. And thank you very much as well for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.